And John Dominic Crossan is joining us today from his home near Orlando, Florida. And John Dominic Crossan, welcome. Thanks for being with us.
It's a pleasure to be back with you, Doug, once more.
I want to begin by asking you say because of the importance of Christmas and because it's so widely observed in the world, certainly the Western world, that it's important that we understand the stories of the birth of Jesus, that this matters. Why do you think this matters?
It matters because I think the message is of importance way beyond Christianity, and certainly that message could come to us in other religions. I have no reason to think there's a monopoly on it in Christianity, but if we're going to mention Christmas and we're going to talk about Christmas, we should at least know what we're talking about, and if we're denying it or affirming it, know what we're doing, what we're talking about.
Let's talk about first the way most Christians hear the story or understand the story. And there's a clue there. It's not just story, as I said before. Most don't understand there are actually two stories here, and I guess it's important to say they're significantly different in many ways.
And it's really the difference that tells us and lets us see what Matthew and Luke are trying to do. And it's only a basic courtesy when somebody speaks to you or writes to you that the first thing you do is try to understand, okay, what do you want to tell me? Then I can decide whether I agree with you, of course, or disagree with you. I have to listen first. And that means in this case we have actually to read the story. It's a sort of a radical suggestion. When all else fails, read the text. Right. So go back and read the story, Matthew and Luke, and what strikes you is how different it is. And the point that arises from that is not sort of a gleeful look at mistakes or discrepancies. It is a warning that each of these writers had very different purposes. They were each going to write a sort of an overture to their own quite distinctive gospels that followed.
The stories of Christmas are personal, you say, but we also have to understand them as being political. Talk about that.
In one sense, we've almost sentimentalized it by taking half the story. It is the story about the birth of a child, and surely in all the world that is a happy event. So why should the birth of this child, for example, make the local king, who happens to be Herod the Great at the time, decide that he had a royal obligation to kill him? What's threatening about the birth of a little child? What's threatening about a baby? So rather than sentimentalize it, we have to ask that question. Why did the birth of Jesus within this time and place threaten anyone?
Let me ask you what you were getting at with the book, because you say early on in it, you and Marcus Borg, that you're not concerned with the factuality of the birth stories. You're thinking about it differently.
Yeah, what we wanted to say was it is our considered judgment that both Matthew and Luke set out to write a parable. And we mean that in the very strict sense in which most Christians, and indeed most people, have heard of the parables of Jesus, and they may have heard at least of the story of the Good Samaritan. And most Christians are aware that it's no problem that is a fiction, that Jesus made up that story. But at the end of that made-up story, Jesus says, go and do likewise. So even though we're listening to a made-up story, a creation, a parable in plain language, it is a lure for decision and action. So a parable can tell you to do something. So we're using that term and saying, as Jesus made up stories about God, the evangelists, let us say, picked up that habit from Jesus and made up stories about him, Jesus.
So you're making this distinction that you're not trying to debunk a story. You say people who look at, for example, the contradictions between Matthew and Luke are debunkers. You're not doing that. You're looking at the differences as a way of seeing them as you say, separate narratives.
Yes, Doug. And I mean, if you thought of, supposing somebody, let's imagine the first audience hearing Jesus' story of the Good Samaritan, and supposing they broke into immediate debate about, did that really happen? Is this a piece of gossip? Did it happen yesterday and Jesus is passing on a story we all should know about? Is this the news, as it were, program? Most people would say, get a life. It's a parable. Jesus just made it up. But the point is that if you stayed on that factuality point, did it really happen? Did the Good Samaritan go down that road and help the Jew who was beaten and left to die in the ditch? if you got into that argument, you would have very wisely, prudently avoided the challenge of the parable, which is, if you find your enemy in the ditch, what are you going to do about it? Go and do likewise. So in one sense, we are saying, from our point of view, the accounts in Matthew and Luke are not and were not intended to be history in their details. Of course, Jesus was born. Of course, Mary and Joseph existed. So did Bethlehem. So did Nazareth. So did Herod. But the story were intended to be parables. And to debate the facticity and historicity of them is a way of avoiding their challenge.
You say that inside of these stories you will find the entire Christian gospel in miniature. Get it, you right, and you get everything. Miss it, and you miss it all.
If you've ever seen an ancient manuscript, say, of the gospel, the first thing it does is make your head spin. It doesn't have all the divisions of chapters of verses that we have. It doesn't have paragraphs. It doesn't even have periods. It's all written in uppercase capitals, and there's not even divisions between the words. So you'd be really happy for somebody who writes a sort of an overture, a prologue up front in the first two chapters, and is giving you sort of, like, here's an outline of what I'm going to be saying in the next, what we call, say, 24 chapters for Luke, 28 for Matthew. It's like a help to the reader. So pay attention to the first two chapters. As we tell you about the birth of this child, we're really going to outline the destiny of this child. So read carefully the prologue or the overture is their message.
What do you think it means, Professor Crossan, that throughout over time, people have sort of conflated the two stories, harmonized the two stories? Is there anything wrong with that? Is that sort of a natural inclination?
Well, there's nothing wrong with harmonizing the stories as long as you don't gut the message in the process.
Yeah.
If we had 3 or 4 versions, say, of the Good Samaritan, we only have one in Luke. If we had 4 versions and we sort of put them all together, that would be fine as long as the main thing is that the Samaritan stops to help the person left for dead. That's the core of the message. So it's not really that we want to launch an attack on do not unite these stories. If you want to put the shepherds into the crib alongside the wise men, that's fine. Just don't call the wise men kings, because the kings in this story are bad. They're on the other side. Herod is the king. So when you have the wise men, if you want to count them as 3, go right ahead. It's not in the New Testament, but that's not fighting over.
Right.
If you want to put names on them, that's fine. That's not worth arguing about. But they are the wisdom of the East confronting the power of the West, and that is important then and now. So when you unite them, if you do, know what you're doing and make certain you don't leave out the heart of the matter.
Do you think that Christians do the same thing with the Bible, in the sense that they see it as this kind of one monolithic narrative as opposed to a collection of very different stories told in different times with different historical context behind them?
They do very often. So it's a process that goes on. It goes on, say, with the 4 stories of the execution of Jesus. And here's what is important. When Christians first put titles on what we call the 4 Gospels or the New Testament Gospels, they never called them the Gospels. They called them the Gospel, singular, according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. As far as they were concerned, there was only one Gospel, namely the good news that not Caesar, but Christ was Lord of the universe. That was their good news. And they knew there was different versions of that. There was the version according to Matthew, according to Luke, so they understood that. We tend to conflate the whole thing together, then get into hundreds of years of arguments, but Matthew says this and Luke says that, and how do we reconcile them? And the people who put the 4 versions in there were just as intelligent as we are and could see all of that and knew that that was not the point. The point was one gospel in multiple versions.
When did the nativity stories, when did they start, when did they emerge, I guess, in Christianity? When did they start to become important?
Well, I think they were there very, very early. But Mark, for example, which is the first gospel, well, let's go back even before Mark. Paul is writing his epistles in 50s, let's say,
Yeah.
the middle of the first century, the most thing he has to say about Jesus is that he was born of a woman, and generally speaking, most of us would have guessed that even without Paul telling us. It's the usual way to enter the world.
Right.
But there's not a hint in Paul of any of the other things. Paul would have loved to be able to say, and I am speaking to the Gentiles because Gentiles came and worshipped Christ when he was a baby. I don't think you can say, well, Paul just didn't use those stories. He simply doesn't know them. They were not created yet. They weren't there when Mark wrote his account of the gospel in, say, the 70s, early 70s. It's in the 80s and the 90s that Matthew and Luke, and only Matthew and Luke, and nobody else in early Christianity that's not dependent on them, decided to tell us their unique way of, here's how Jesus was born for Luke, here's how Jesus was born for Matthew.
So at what point did they become, it seems in some ways, maybe this is not entirely the case, but the way Christians look on the death of Jesus Christ and the resurrection and that story, it seems in some ways the story of the birth is as important to Christians. At what point did it become so critical in the larger story?
Well, it started very immediately. I think even by the end of the 2nd century, when you're starting to get images of Christ, Mary holding the child, and even the wise men coming to him is an image. I think it may be really with Francis, say in the 13th century, that when Christ had almost threatened to disappear into the clouds as sort of a transcendental divinity and the humanity had got lost, that one way to insist on the humanity, to insist on it, is to imagine him as a baby, to imagine him being born, to imagine his mother. So I think it's one of the great ways throughout Christianity, then and now, of insisting on the humanity, and for Christians that should not be over against the divinity, but on both together as like two sides of the one coin.
John Dominic Crossan, because mentioning the distinctions are, I think it would be important. It's surprising, I guess, maybe first of all, how little of Matthew's birth story is about Jesus, for example. Jesus, you write, in the nativity story, is almost off the stage.
Yes, in Matthew, we'll focus on Matthew just for a moment.
Yeah.
Matthew tells the whole thing through the viewpoint of Joseph. It's rather patriarchal. Joseph is not supposed to be the father, actually, according to Matthew, but it's all told through him. The Annunciation is made actually not to Mary, but to Joseph in a dream at night in Matthew, and you might note how few images, paintings, sculptures have ever been made of that Annunciation scene. We usually always get it from Luke, where the angel Gabriel appears to Mary. But in Matthew, it's all told from the point of view of Joseph. And as you mentioned at the beginning, as far as Matthew is concerned, the family is living at Bethlehem and only moves from Bethlehem to Nazareth at the end of the story. Then everything is told through Joseph's point of view. The major theme, I suppose, that's in Matthew, and it's a dark theme, by the way, is that as soon as the Magi, wise men, the wisdom of the East, as I said, come to Herod and tell him that they're looking for the King of the Jews, which, of course, is Herod's own title, and he has rather a monopoly on it, shall we say, he immediately interprets that to mean the Messiah, that is the just king whom Israel had hoped would come to liberate them and to rule the world in peace and justice and nonviolence. Immediately, Herod then sets out, as we know, to kill this newborn child by killing all the male children under 2 years in Bethlehem. And then the flight into Egypt takes place, so that as far as Matthew is concerned, as long as the Jewish homeland is under Herod the Great in collaboration with Rome, it has become the new Egypt, and Herod is the new Pharaoh who had tried to kill all the young Jewish males in order to kill Moses. So Jesus, in a huge irony for Matthew, is fleeing into Egypt, not out of Egypt as Moses had. The Jewish homeland under Herod is the new Egypt.